Welcome to Candidates Debate. Tonight's program features a face-to-face meeting of the candidates for Vermont's lone seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Here to introduce the panelists and also the candidates for tonight's debate is the president of the sponsoring organization, the Rutland DPW, Barbara Loeffler.
Thanks, Bruce. We will begin our introductions with the incumbent independent congressman from Burlington, Bernard Sanders, the Democratic candidate from Brattleboro, Lewis Young, the Republican candidate from Wallingford, Tim Philbin, and the Liberty Union candidate from Brattleboro, Peter Diamondstone. On behalf of the Rutland Business and Professional Women, Adelphia Cable, Rutland Herald, and WSYB, welcome candidates.
With that, we'll begin our debate. We'll begin by the panelists. Jack Hoffman and Chris Pearson will be alternately asking questions of the candidates, working through them. This will continue for 40 minutes. At the 40-minute mark or thereabouts, we'll switch to kind of a different thing where candidates will ask questions directly to other candidates. So we'll begin the questioning with Jack Hoffman, Chief of the Vermont Press Bureau.
Congressman Sanders, judging by the polls, it would appear that there's a good chance that Democrats will control both the White House and the Congress for at least the next 2 years. Why wouldn't Vermont be better off having a Democrat in the House of Representatives to work with the Congress, and how would you propose to work with a Democrat administration in Congress?
Well, Jack, I think we can judge how effective I'll be under a Democratic president with Democrats continuing to control the Congress based on what I've already done in the first 2 years. And I think in the first 2 years that I've been in office, we've established a very, very solid record. The fact of the matter is that while I am supporting Mr. Clinton, and I think Mr. Clinton will be an improvement over Mr. Bush, there is no question in my mind that both the Democratic and Republican parties are out of touch with the needs of the vast majority of working people in this country, with elderly people and with poor people. As you know, 2 years ago, Vermont made history by sending the first independent progressive to the Congress. All over the country, people have been looking to Vermont for political leadership. So I think the fact that we have broken out of the two-party system is, in fact, a major step forward. If Clinton becomes president, I will be able to continue to work with my friends within the Democratic Party in fighting for a number of pieces of legislation which President Bush vetoed: parental leave, campaign finance reform, tax reform, environmental protection legislation stronger than what was just passed. So I look forward to working under President Clinton. I will be disagreeing with him on a number of issues. His support for NAFTA is not acceptable to me. The free trade agreement with Mexico, he's wrong. His health care proposals are not strong enough. But there is no question that if you have a president who will not be vetoing every single piece of legislation which makes sense to ordinary people, if we are able to put together a caucus, a progressive caucus in Congress, which I am working on, which will fight for a single-payer national health care system, which will fight to ask the wealthy to start paying their fair share of taxes, which will fight for a new job program in the United States by cutting military spending, reinvesting in the United States so we could rebuild our infrastructure, our educational system. I think we're going to see some real changes in this country, and I look forward to participating in that process.
Mr. Young, Congressman Sanders has voted pretty much down the Democratic Party line in the votes that came up. You are a Democrat and you're running. Are you running as a spoiler to keep Tim Philbin out, or to keep him from getting the more conservative Democrats that perhaps wouldn't support Mr. Sanders?
No, that was not my motive at all. I entered this contest late because no other Democrat stepped forward to run for this office this year. I found myself without anybody that I could support for this office in an enthusiastic way. And as I've gone around the state, and I have put a lot of miles on that car of mine, I have talked with thousands of people who feel the same way. They were torn on which direction to go, to the very far right or to the very far left. I believe that I represent a very broad middle ground. And I'm not only a member of the Democratic Party, I'm a cooperative team player and a member of that vast majority of people, the working people of this country that Mr. Sanders referred to. I know what working people go through. I understand their concerns. I've lived that life.
Mr. Philbin, I'll ask you a similar question to Congressman Sanders. it does appear the Democrats are likely to control the Congress and the White House this year. How would you cooperate with the Democratic president, or would you oppose his actions just as President Bush has complained about the Democrats in Congress?
Well, I think the time for complaining and ranting and raving and trying to establish your own personal ideological third party are over. There comes a point in time now where people in Washington have to begin addressing the problems that confront individual taxpayers like myself and the people out watching this program tonight. The Democrats, some of them have very good ideas. The Republicans have very good ideas. Adopt the very best that both parties have to offer, come to some form of consensus, and do something. The time for posturing and politicizing solutions to problems are over. This nation is looking at a $4 trillion debt. They're looking at a budget that is out of balance. We're looking at politicians who go to Washington who are more interested in getting themselves elected or reelected, taking political action committee money, and paying off those kinds of insidious, incestuous relationships that they have than trying to finally resolve problems. And I'm tired of politicians who just go down there and try to posture themselves for their own personal political gains. I think now is the time where you begin working with people so that Vermont once again has a voice in Washington. What has happened over the last 2 years is that we have a situation now where Vermonters, their only seat in the United States House of Representatives, cannot affect any change because Democrats and Republicans will not work with the individual who's currently there. Therefore, go down, open up your hand, extend it in friendship, and begin working to solve problems. And take the very best ideas from both parties and use them to resolve problems.
Mr. Diamondstone, you're sort of a perpetual candidate for this office. I know I've interviewed you several times. It's very far-fetched that you'll actually win. Why do you keep running?
I don't run. I offer myself as a candidate for the office, and I'll either get hired by the November hiring committee or I won't get hired. I do that because I really am the best politician that the state has to choose from. For example, on the issue of the war, nobody will speak out on the war, the ongoing war against the people of Iraq. It took until last Sunday, or Sunday, September 27th, for Congressperson Sanders to finally acknowledge that he continues to support the naval war against the people of Iraq. And that war has killed more people than Bush's part of the war, which is the part which is called the aerial war and the ground war. But nobody is willing to raise that issue. For example, the United States now acknowledges that 158,000 people were killed by the aerial war and ground war that took place between January 17th, 1991 Iraqi time and March 7th, 1991 DC time. The naval war, the blockade, has already killed 225,000 children under the age of 5 years by diarrhea, dysentery, and dehydration, and minor ailments that could have been cured and taken care of in a hospital system as sophisticated as the Iraqi system. But people like Congressperson Sanders persist in preventing the flow of those essential goods into Iraq to prevent those kinds of deaths among young people and among the very old, and preventing the Iraqis from rebuilding their water and sewer system so that their people won't continue to be killed by the food and the water that they drink.
Mr. Young,
Yes.
can you give us some idea what you would do to try to balance the federal budget? Perhaps not details down to the penny, but generally, do you support increasing taxes, spending cuts, and can you tell us generally what areas you would be willing to cut?
That's a difficult question. We all know that the budget needs to be brought into balance. We're getting deeper and deeper into debt all the time. We have a $4 trillion national debt. With the annual deficit we have, in 3 years it's going to be $5 trillion. Nobody wants to raise taxes, but I'm sure we all agree that it's not just a problem of the federal government. It belongs to all of us and to our children and our grandchildren. We've got to take control now. We didn't dig this hole overnight. We're not going to fill it up overnight. But we need to start balancing the budget. And how do you do it in your household or your business? You either enhance revenue or you cut expenses. I don't want to see taxes raised on the middle class and the working people of this country. They're already heavily burdened. But the people who make the higher incomes, like $150,000, $200,000 a year on up, should start paying their fair share of taxes. We've got to start cutting various agencies by a certain arbitrary percentage, say a 10% across the board cut, and maybe restore those dollars, dollar by dollar, on a justified, means-tested basis. Prove the need for the money. Don't base it on last year's budget. That's about all I have to say on that.
Right, Mr. Sanders, the breast cancer registry that passed just a day or so ago is probably your major accomplishment in the past few years you've been in Congress. What I don't understand is you've been such a strong advocate for finding a cure and for breast cancer, why you would support a socialized form of health care when in countries with socialized medicine, mammographies can take up to 6 months for a diagnostic mammography. And in Canada, the problem with it is that they are forced to do mammographies so quickly that the doctors themselves feel that they're missing things because they're not doing that well.
Chris, I think you and I may have a slight disagreement about the issue of national health care. In terms of national health care, as I hope you understand, the United States today is spending some $800 billion for the chaotic system, the system which is failing so many people now. We have something like 85 million Americans who either have no health insurance or only partially insured. Elderly people are spending an enormous amount of their out-of-pocket money for prescription drugs. We rank 21st in the world in terms of infant mortality, 12th in terms of how long we live, and the cost of health care is zooming up. Our system is falling apart. Now, the truth is, it's funny, I hear very often people in this country, when they talk about the Canadian system, they forget to tell us a couple of things. First of all, when you compare our system to the Canadians, please understand we spend 40% more per capita than the Canadians do. Second of all, when you go to Canada and you talk to Canadians, they are very supportive of their healthcare system, very proud of their healthcare system. Poll after poll suggests that the Canadians feel much better about their system than we feel about our system. The doctors in Canada, as a matter of fact, feel very proud of their system. Now, is their system perfect? No, it's not. Does it have problems? Yes, it does. But the fact of the matter is that in every province in Canada, every citizen can go into any doctor they want, any hospital they want, get all of the treatment that they need without out-of-pocket expense. Now, as a matter of fact, I think we can do better than the Canadians because we are already spending significantly more money than the Canadians. But when you compare the Canadian system to our system, do not forget, I have talked to more than a few Vermonters who cannot go to the doctor, who cannot go to the hospital because they don't have any insurance and they're scared to death of the bill that will come. So my own view is that we need radical changes in our healthcare system. It is falling apart. We are one of 2 nations in the industrialized world that does not have, in one form or another, a national healthcare system guaranteeing healthcare to all people. I have introduced legislation to do that, and the momentum is with us. The day will come when every American will be able to walk in any doctor's office, any hospital they want, get all the health care that they need without out-of-pocket expense. And you know what? As a nation, it will not cost us more money than we're currently spending.
Mr. Diamondstone, rightly or wrongly, I think much of the public is more concerned about what's happening in this country, particularly the economy, than what's occurring in Iraq now. Do you have any proposals for improving the economy, and do you see Congress having a role in that?
Well, you know, you can't separate problems of the budget from problems of war. And it's sort of hypocritical for people to come here as candidates and talk about medical care for all people while the people of Iraq die every moment in a country that had the most sophisticated medical care system in the entire Arab world and can't rebuild that because of the blockade. The first thing we should do is save that money, right? And we should stop the funding for the United States naval blockade, the naval war being carried on against the people of Iraq. That's the first way. Now, of course, my proposals really go much further than that, and I would, as a member of Congress, at least put on the floor for consideration. the fact that the Constitution won't let us have a military budget unless we are at war, and there is no current declaration of war. So I would advocate a zero military budget to my co-members of the U.S. House. The other end of it is we need to raise money, and Congressperson Sanders talks about taxing the corporations, big corporations. Well, big corporations never pay taxes. Big corporations pass the taxes that we impose on them onto us in the form of goods and services, or just a sales tax, a very regressive form. At the other end, he says we got to make the wealthy pay their fair share, but the only way to do that for somebody like Larry Bird or Paul Newman or Dr. DeBakey, I mean, if you increase the rate of tax that they pay, well, they just raise the fees that they charge us for the services that they perform, so that at some level, we have to say that above this level, you can't make any more money because we're going to tax you at 100%, and that's going to help to reduce the deficit, because then wealthy people will have to pay taxes. Right now, they don't pay taxes. All they do is take money from us and pay it over.
Thank you.
Is my time up?
Your time is up.
I didn't see the card, sorry.
Mr. Philbin, my question to you is pretty much similar to what Mr. Hoffman asked. You've been accused of being out of the mainstream. You have refused to take PAC money. You've signed a contract saying that if you don't do what the voters like, you won't run again. But at this point, it looks like there is going to be a pretty much Democratic leadership in the White House. Who's going to listen to you if you go down? You're on the right. You're sort of a Reaganomics person, and things are swinging to the left. So who's going to listen to you?
There you go again, Reaganomics person. I think that first off, you've made a lot of assumptions here, and you've assumed first off that Mr. Clinton is going to win the White House. Again, polls said the other guy was going to win the primary. I won the primary. So let's remember that polls first off are a snapshot in time. Number two, as I indicated, you need to go down there with the idea that your job is not to work to form a new political party. Your job is not to go down there and further your own personal political career. Your responsibility is to go down with the voice of the people of Vermont, and that is all that you're supposed to do. And when you go down there to work with other individuals. I don't take PAC money so that I don't have to pay back IOUs, and I only take dollars from people, for instance, from Vermont. That's important, because those are the people that I am going to be working for. They are the employers, I would be the employee. When you go down there, you go down with ideas like line item veto for the president, whether it be a Democrat or a Republican, so they can pull out of legislation, sometimes very good legislation, self-serving pork barrel dollars that they put in there so that they can help themselves get reelected or pay back their cronies that gave them dollars, or political action committees that gave it to them. Zero-based budgeting, you use those kinds of ideas. You use performance standards for all the different departments that come before you and ask for money. You work to put in a capital gains tax cut, the purpose of which is the longer you hold your investment, the greater the reduction in taxes, so that homeowners and farmers and people who want to create jobs or to expand their factories here in Vermont will have an opportunity to invest for the long term, so that we can have those kinds of dollars come into Vermont. You also look to instill an investment tax credit so businesses in Vermont can expand and provide jobs. And when you go down there, you don't willy-nilly say, we need to cut the defense budget by 50%, because that means people who work at places like General Electric will lose their jobs. You go down there and represent Vermonters, not your own personal political ideology.
Mr. Sanders, you've advocated higher taxes on the rich. Would you also reduce other government benefits to the rich, such as limits on mortgage deductions, military pensions, Social Security payments, Medicare?
Okay, you're mixing. I have advocated higher taxes on the wealthy because, as you know, in the last dozen years, the wealthiest people in our country have seen a very significant increase in their incomes, and yet the tax rate for the very wealthiest people have gone down, while middle-income people have seen a decline in their standard of living. Their tax burden has gone up. That seems to me to be very wrong. In terms of limiting mortgage deductions, yeah. If you're talking about people now owning several homes, for example, wealthy people own several homes and are able to deduct the interest they're paying on these homes, yeah, that's wrong. That is a tax break for the rich. On the other hand, when you talk about Social Security and perhaps Medicare, No, my own feeling is that the best way to tax the wealthy and the fairest way is through a progressive income tax, asking the wealthy there to pay their fair share of taxes. When you start talking about increasing taxes on Social Security or capping Medicare for quote-unquote wealthy people, this is what my fear is, Jack, and I believe this is really in the wings and might happen. Right now, Social Security is a contract that exists between the government and the people of this country, people who are eligible for Social Security. I think once you start tampering with that, once you start tampering with the Medicare system, then eventually what you're going to have are quote-unquote welfare programs for low-income senior citizens. When you separate wealthy people from middle-income or working people who are getting Social Security, that's what's going to happen. Social Security is only for poor elderly people. I think that's wrong. Social Security is a contract. We've got to keep it whole. The same thing with Medicare. The way to raise income in a progressive way is by an increase in taxes on wealthy people, whether they're 90 years old or whether they're 18 years of old, not by increasing taxes on Social Security or capping Medicare programs.
Mr. Young, I talked with Congressman Sanders a bit about national health care. It's a question that nobody seems to have the answers to. Some information says the Canadians are very happy with their system. Some information says that the Canadian system is falling to pieces, that the poor in Canada are dying because it takes 5 years for them to get the operations they need, and the rich come to the United States to get them, so the poor in both countries lose out. What are you going to do about national health care if you get down to Congress?
Well, I agree that we need universal health care. Mr. Sanders is correct. We have 85 million people in this country who are either not covered or have insufficient coverage. Health care, adequate health care, should be the right of every American citizen. Paying for it is going to be the thing that we have to be concerned about. We are paying 40% more per capita in this country for health care. If the monies that were put into the healthcare system as it is now, which is a hodgepodge, it's a jigsaw puzzle, were put into funding a universal system with the option of keeping your own private health care if you want to, I think it could go a long way toward solving some of these healthcare problems. The Canadian system, I've met some Canadians who are happy with it, and I've met some Canadians who are very distressed with the Canadian system, particularly the rationing situation. Having to wait in long lines, having to wait too long to get treatment for a particular problem. We need to have a system that can address a necessary problem as needed right now and not put people into long waiting lines and not be rationing. We have to fund this through probably payroll deductions similar to FICA with employee and employer contributions. What's going into private insurance companies now could be utilized to supplement that. A lot of the money that's going into Medicare and Medicaid could also go into that healthcare system, and I would advocate the raising of tobacco taxes and alcohol taxes, which are detrimental to human health, and allocating those funds specifically for healthcare.
Mr. Philbin, as I understand your position on abortion, you believe that it's an issue that should be left to the states. Does that mean that if there were federal legislation proposed that would restrict access to abortion in any way, that you would oppose that in Congress?
If there was, say that again, Jack. So I understand
If there was, as I understand, you want to leave any regulation of abortion to the states. It's a decision that should be made at the state level. Does that mean if there is legislation proposed in Congress that might restrict access to abortion, that you would vote against that and instead defer to the states?
No, if legislation came before me, I would have to take a stand because I do have that very strong personal belief. My first choice, though, and I would introduce legislation, is to see to it that those decisions do go back to the states. But if perchance those decisions come before me, I will act upon them.
Isn't that somewhat inconsistent? I mean,
No, I don't think so.
You think this should be determined at the state level, why wouldn't you leave it then to the states to make that decision?
I don't think it's inconsistent because my first choice, again, is to send it back to the states. But I'm not going to shun my responsibility to speak to that issue. I think that's too easy for politicians to dodge that. If it comes before you, deal with it. My first choice, though, and I would introduce legislation, is to see to it that that issue goes back to the states.
Mr. Diamondstone, you're a third-party candidate. We already have an independent in Congress. If you were elected, why would you be different than Mr. Sanders?
not a third-party candidate, I'm an alternative party candidate. That's what the press always does, talks about third parties. Everybody but the Democrats and the Republicans is a third party. The implication of the language is that there are two parties. I'm the one who's saying that there's only one other party. So let's use a non-pejorative term like the word alternative. When you did that, you know, it's like saying he when you mean student. You blocked out, everything else got blocked out for me. Would you repeat the rest of your question?
What I want to know
get really
is...
upset when people use that expression to describe me.
My apologies. What I'd like to know is that because you're not one of the two major parties, you would not be a congressman for one of the two major parties, why would you be in a different boat than Congressman Sanders?
Oh, I'm probably the only candidate for public office who's willing to talk freely about the issues and openly and honestly. For example, one of the things that we didn't touch on in the tax question before was exemptions for religious institutions and exemptions for the Heritage Foundation and exemptions for Harvard University's endowment fund and so on. I want to do away with those things. Why should we, as citizens, have to support those private institutions? Well, nobody else will talk about those issues, right? I mean, we now, for example, homosexuals now have to support the Catholic Church. The Pope has come out and opposed any kind of legislation that would give equal rights to homosexuals. Well, why should homosexuals have to pay higher taxes to support the Catholic Church when the Catholic Church is promoting the hatred of homosexuals? So what I'm saying is there should be no tax exemptions, and I use that example as just one. Why should there be anybody be exempt? Let everybody pay their fair share. I mean, at least pay at the tax rate that we have, even if it's not a fair rate of tax. Why should churches get off? Why should the Heritage Foundation, the Guardian Foundation, and so on? Nobody else will talk about those issues. I think that the people of Vermont... I don't like this stuff.
Mr. Young, I'd like to go back to the budget and the deficit question. You suggested, for example, it might take a 10% across the board cut, and then you could justify putting some of that money back. But it would take a 25% across the board cut to balance the budget, and there are big chunks of that which are off limits. For example, interest payments, entitlement payments. So would you like to give that a try again? Where would you cut the budget to get it down somewhere close to balance?
Thank you very much. I'm Superman, and I'm going to go save the country single-handedly. We need to cut wherever we can, and not with a meat axe. We need to take a scalpel to it, because I don't want anybody to get hurt. But we have to start. We have to make a start. We have to establish the problem. I think we've established the problem. We have to set a goal, and I think we've established that, too. How do we get from here to there? We have no roadmap, so it's going to be a step-by-step process. It's going to be like a ship sailing against the wind, and it's off course most of the time. But eventually, if we keep that goal in mind, stand united working toward this goal, we will eventually make some progress in that direction. If you say, I can't, you give up automatically. It's a nasty word, can't. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You say, I can, you're going to try. We've got to start cutting somewhere. Cut congressional staff, cut White House staff, cut down the military budget, but not with a meat axe. You're going to have to go at it gradually. You're going to have to take some of this money that you're cutting out of the current federal budget and temporarily, instead of squandering, you're going to have to take these same monies and use them to invest in the rebuilding of the infrastructure, in the healing and rebuilding of our inner cities, in the creation of jobs, so that the jobs create the paychecks, which generate the revenue into the government that will pay the bills and help to balance the budget. As I said, you don't dig these holes overnight, you don't fill them up overnight. It's going to take a long time and a lot of hard work and dedication and sacrifice from everybody in this country.
Mr. Sanders, we've talked to some of the other candidates about the budget deficit, and that a big concern is about 50% of the taxes that we are already paying are going into just interest on the budget deficit. When you've been approached on that question before, you've suggested that we slash the military budget by 50% at least. However, you've also said that we need to put more money into social programs, and you've said we can slash the military budget by 50% and put that money into social programs. The numbers don't add up. We can't do both with that money.
Chris, I think I have been very clear on what I have said. What I have said is that now that the Cold War is over, the Soviet Union doesn't exist. The Warsaw Pact does not exist. To me, very frankly, it is insane, underline insane, to be spending $135 billion, that's a B, $billion a year, defending Japan, Germany, and Western Europe against a non-existent enemy. Now, what I have said is that over a 5-year period, we can lower military spending by 50%, put some of that money, not all of it, into deficit reduction, and some of that money back home so we rebuild America. Now, Mr. Philbin said that if we cut defense spending, some of our people are going to lose jobs. That's true. But the truth of the matter is we can gain more jobs in a vibrant civilian economy by improving our infrastructure, our educational system, by developing an industrial policy which retools and rebuilds our manufacturing base, which is rapidly declining, by stopping the exodus of jobs to Mexico and to Asia, where corporations are paying people 50 cents or $1 an hour. In fact, reinvesting in America, rebuilding our country, rebuilding our housing, building the housing that we need for our homeless and for all of our people. Doing all of those things creates more jobs than military spending. But in order to deal with the deficit, one way is some of that military spending reduction should go into the deficit. You also ask the wealthy to start paying their fair share of taxes. And you know what else you do? You don't dump the S&L fiasco into the deficit, as both the Democratic and Republican leadership suggest that we do. You ask those crooks and their friends who profited out of the S&L fiasco to pick up that burden, and you don't ask working people to pay off the deficit, which is the present plan. Fourthly, you begin to control health care spending through a national health care program. And fifthly, you cut back on intelligence. We're spending $30 billion a year for intelligence. You don't need that. You do away with space stations, which you don't need, Super Collider, all kinds of projects. You can move toward a balanced budget without hurting the elderly, working people, or the poor, and I'm helping and fighting in the Congress to lead that effort.
Mr. Diamondstone, what would you like to see happen with health care?
One of the problems with the British system, the Canadian system, is that side by side with those sort of, well, there's a separate private system. And what happens is that people can avoid using the healthcare system that's available in Canada or Britain through government funding, and can use some other private funding, some other privately funded system. And so then those are people with power and with wealth, and they keep withdrawing more and more money from the system, or keep it level funded while costs go up so that the level of services drops for those who have to rely on that system. For me, we have to have a system that says only one system of medical and hospital trauma and disease care in this country. Only one. Everybody has to have access to it. And then the wealthy will want to spend money to make sure that it's a good system, because they won't have any place else to go. If we have functioning side by side the multiple system, private and public, then the wealthy will use the private system and use their power to see that as little funding as possible goes into the public system. So, and I see that is happening already in Canada, and that's already happening in Britain. And so you can see how those two systems are failing, and the criticisms that Chris made or offered earlier are real. So the only thing that we can afford to do, every physician goes on a government payroll, whether it be town, county, state, just like police officers, right? All hospitals are run by government, by community, by elected officials, right? No more will they be privatized under the system that I would advocate. That would be real universal health care, and trauma and disease care, not health care.
Mr. Philbin, you've been a big advocate of cutting federal spending. The problem with that is that it's sort of like what some of your opponents have said when it comes to raising costs on people. It gets passed through to the consumer. If you cut federal spending, the federal government says, fine, but the state will have to take care of these things. We still have certain mandates. The state says, oh, fine, we have these mandates, we have no money to pay for them, and therefore the towns can take care of them, and the towns go, ooh, property taxes, more property taxes. How are you going to cut the federal budget and cut spending at a federal level without overwhelmingly increasing the burden on local property taxpayers?
That's a good question, Chris, because I agree with you that whenever the state or the federal government passes on mandates to local communities or the states, they should also send along the funding for it, which is why when I talked about revamping something like the welfare system, I talked about a work fair, learn fair program, which we designed here in Vermont. It was first started under the late Governor Richard Snelling, carried on by now Governor Dean, the purpose of which was design a program by and for Vermonters here in the state of Vermont. But the problem we have is that in order for us to implement that, we have to get waivers from the people in Washington. You have two levels of administration. You have a level of administration here in Vermont, you have a level of administration in Washington. If you remove this level of administration and send the dollars back in block grant forms to the states, allow the states to revamp that, in the welfare systems alone, the ANFC, the food stamps, and some of the Medicare costs of administering that, you can save $6.15 billion. That can do two things. You can use that to reduce the costs that we now have to pay off the debt and to help balance the budget, and at the same time allow the states the freedom and the ability to plan. Vermont is not New York, we're not Chicago, we're not California. We don't need an iron fist from Washington telling us how we must live. Send us back in the form of block grants. It is something we used to do in the past, and allow the states the freedom to implement that. Burlington has some mass transit, and therefore people under a workfare program would be able to get to the various job sites. Newport has very high unemployment, doesn't have the same kind of mass transit system, so they're going to have to look a little bit differently at this type of a program. That kind of freedom, that returning government closest to the people so that we here in Vermont have a way to impact upon that is the most important thing that we can do, because we are tired of mandates from Washington and quite frankly from Montpelier. In order to make that change, give the people in the states the freedom by sending those dollars back in the form of a block grant and also cut the administrative costs in Washington.
Mr. Sanders, Mr. Philbin has said that he would limit his spending to $300,000 in this campaign. Why aren't you willing to accept a similar limitation?
Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, we will be spending less money, 10% less in real dollars than we spent in 1990.
Which would be how much?
It'd be about $540,000 altogether. Number two, what we are doing is mounting what I believe is one of the strongest grassroots efforts that the state has seen. And we're opening offices all over the state. We're printing up literature. We're going to have people going door to door. So for us, as we build a progressive movement in the state of Vermont, the issue is involving people in the process. And I have the feeling we're going to end up involving more people in this campaign than we've ever done before. Last point on that is that when I ran for governor in 1986, I was outspent 10 to 1. When I ran for Congress in 88 and 90, I was outspent by several $100,000. I don't have to buy this election. We are limiting the amount of money that we could spend in order to communicate with people, and we take that opportunity to do so. I should also say, that in terms of campaign finances, we are going to end up this campaign with more individual contributors, far more individual contributors from the state of Vermont than all of my opponents combined. I guess we're going to end up with 1,500 or 1,600 Vermonters who are contributing to this campaign. But basically, to answer your question, is we want a strong enough campaign to be able to communicate with people from one end of the state to another, and that's how much it costs us to do that.
Mr. Young, this is a sort of philosophical question. It stems from President Bush saying he would do whatever it takes to get reelected. To that end, and sort of with an eye toward the general political climate, does the end justify the means? If you get down to Congress, are you willing to give up strongly held belief, for instance, in cutting certain things in order to get something that you find or you feel would be much better in the long run?
Politics is the art of compromise. If I have to put aside a deeply held personal belief in order to accomplish a greater good for the greater number of the people of Vermont, they are my employers. I have done this all my working life. I have found myself in a situation where I didn't quite agree with the boss, but it was my job to follow through on what was best for the company I worked for. The company I intend to be working for is the state of Vermont in Washington, and my employers will be the people of Vermont.
So does the end
But I am not, no, I think you mixed your question there. The end does not justify the means. I think your question is a little bit vague. My end goal in this election campaign is to be elected and to go to Washington and be a voice for Vermont. The means I'm using is black coffee and shoe leather and a lot of gasoline and a lot of time on the road, and we have spent thus far $800 on this campaign. I intend to keep spending under $5,000, and I intend to prevail for the Democratic Party and for the people of this state.
Mr. Philbin, I'd like to go back to your last question. The idea of passing responsibility for programs down to the states, I believe, was tried under the Reagan administration. It was called New Federalism, and I think that the states generally felt that they came out on the short end of the stick. Even if that was successful and cutting the budget by $6.5 billion, as you say, there's still another $325 billion to go.
Sure.
How would you're opposed to taxes, where would you cut the rest of that $300 billion?
Well, there's a whole bunch of different places you can cut. If we can agree, for instance, that the entitlement programs are not going to be cut by anybody in Washington, quite frankly, the politicians are not going to do it. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Therefore, what savings can you make in there because of administrative costs? I talked in 1990 about the potential of looking at shifting the Social Security system from the government owning it and operating it back to individuals owning and operating it over a period of time. That would allow people like my mother not to have a reduction in her benefits or to receive an increase in her benefits at the whim of some politician. Those kinds of dollars can go back into the economy to help create jobs because people own their own Social Security accounts instead of leaving it in the hands of politicians who will use it to balance the budget. We have Medicaid costs of administrative costs that can be shifted back to the states at a lower level. We have Medicare that can be done the same way if we have a national health insurance strategy, which is not going to happen with this administration and with this Congress because they are all posturing themselves for their own personal political gains. The congressman talked about introducing a piece of legislation for health care. 9 people signed on to it. It is going nowhere. It is dead. You have to sit down and begin working to solve problems and not just have your own personal agenda. Other programs that can be cut, Jack, we can sit here and list billions of dollars. Let's look at using different kinds of accounting systems, accrual systems instead of cash systems for some of the insurance programs that we have. Let's look at using performance standards. Let's look at privatizing some of the things that the government now does. There are experiments going on in this country where some of our prisons are now being privatized. Why does the government compete with the private sector in some industries? Why can't we sell off some of the things that the government is now doing where the private sector can do it for less? All of these kinds of things, which we will detail this week, will show that there are ways to save money. We cannot do it overnight. It will take time, but there are substantial savings with management, with administrative, and with program cuts.
Our final question in this portion of our program will come from Chris Pearson, and then we'll move to a little bit different portion of our format.
Mr. Diamondstone, I'm a little bit unsure about your basic philosophy of government. We've talked about what role the government, with some of your opponents, what role the government has in everyday people's life. Are you more government is better, or the government should just stand up and get the heck out of our way?
There are 3 roles government can play. One is it can stay out of business altogether and just everything become a kind of anarchy. Another role is to manage it from a level of regulation. And the third is that government can own it and run it. For the most part, I favor the first, that is, let business alone. For the most part, I completely oppose government regulation. When something isn't working, don't fix it by regulating it. Fix it by taking it over. And let me give you an example. In environmental policy, we have fines for polluters and we require cleaning up. Those 2 systems are used to deal with polluters. When Exxon cleans up the mess, the cost of that gets built into the cost of Exxon gasoline and we pay for it. When Exxon gets fined for making the mess, that gets built into the cost of gasoline and we pay for it. When Exxon makes the mess, the United States government should forfeit. Exxon stockholders should forfeit Exxon, and that should become a government enterprise. Now, we have lots of examples of efficient government enterprise, and one of the most recent one was Conrail, when all the bankrupt railroads threw up their hands. The United States government took it over, managed it for about 10 years, and when it had a $200 million surplus and was worth about $50 billion, the United States Congress joined with President Reagan, the Democratic-controlled Congress joined with President Reagan to sell it for $5 billion back to private industry. What I'm saying is there is no way to escape us paying for those kinds of failures, and forfeiture is not something new. You know, we do that to drug dealers when they
Thank you, Mr.
deal
Johnson.
drugs.
Thank you. This time I knew you were out because of our efficient timekeeper doing a marvelous job. We'll go now into the second part of our format where candidates will ask candidates questions, and we'll do that until our time is up. We'll begin with Representative Sanders.
Thank you very much. Let me ask Mr. Philbin a question. Tim, if I'm not mistaken, you have been pretty consistent in your opposition to increasing taxes for the wealthy. Last year, Congress brought forth the legislation, and it was passed, which would raise taxes for those people making $200,000 a year or more. These are people whose incomes have soared in the last decade, but whose tax rates have gone down. Also, the legislation included a 10% increase in surtax on millionaires. The revenue raised from raising taxes on the wealthy would have gone into reducing taxes for middle income and working people. How would you have voted on that legislation?
Well, I wouldn't have voted for it, because what happens is when you raise taxes on rich people who make $100,000, by your definition.
This one was for $200,000.
Or $200,000 or $300,000. You raise taxes on those individuals, or even corporations, for instance. Go ahead and raise the taxes on people who make a lot of money. Let us assume, no offense intended, that an attorney makes a lot of dollars, or a doctor. They're going to increase their fees on people who have to pay medical bills or people who might need the help of attorneys. Increase taxes, for instance, on corporations like, well, let's take General Motors, let's take Mobil, let's also take Grand Union. The price of our cars go up, the price of our groceries go up, the price of our gasoline goes up. It is a trickle-down theory of taxation.
The question was on individuals. You would not have voted for that.
I would not have voted for that.
Even though it would have lowered taxes on middle income.
It would not have lowered taxes.
That's exactly what the proposal was. It was a shift from
It never does, because they always shift those dollars onto other individuals by increasing their fees. How would you stop them from shifting them? How would you stop them from passing them on?
Your question will come soon. If you complete your answer.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Our next question will come from Mr. Young, and feel free to ask it to any of the other candidates.
I think I'd like to ask Tim about his attitude of shifting pro-choice over to the states. Don't you feel, Tim, that this would close out lower-income women from having freedom of choice, while upper-income women would be free to travel across state lines?
Is that what the state here in Vermont has chosen?
I'm talking freedom of choice. You would have advocated freedom of choice not be a national issue, but be turned back to the states.
Right.
Aren't you concerned that there is the possibility that certain people would be shut out of this freedom of choice, while others would be able to exercise this freedom of choice because they have more money and can be more mobile?
Well, I've been told that this is such a liberal state that it'll always defend freedom of choice, so therefore, if it goes back to the states, they'll probably vote in favor of it, wouldn't they?
What about Kansas?
I don't live in Kansas. I don't represent Kansas. I represent Vermont.
Okay.
And when those decisions are made here in Vermont, they will be made by Vermonters. I mean, that's the purpose of government, Lou. The purpose of government is to allow individuals to make and affect change. And if one group of people feel very strongly on an issue, or another group of people feel very strongly on an issue, they fight for that kind of change. As it stands now in Washington, they can't do it. Can you travel, or anybody here on a regular basis travel to Washington? No, but we can call our representative. We can call our state senator. We can speak to our governor and say, I'm upset. We have the kind of citizen legislature here where we can indeed affect that kind of change.
But don't you believe that as a legislator in Washington, you serve a dual role? The role is twofold. You not only represent the people of Vermont, but you're also deciding national issues.
In some cases, yes, but you decide them with Vermont's ideas. And our idea here in Vermont, Lou, is to have local individuals participate in that government. That has been our heritage, and that is something we need to preserve.
And it might help the medical economy here in Vermont, because people would be coming into this very liberal state to have their abortions here.
That is up to people to choose, Lou. That's the important part.
I think you're wrong.
Mr. Philbin, now you may ask a question.
But we can still be friends. But we can still be friends.
Okay. Last month, Congressman Sanders, You defined rich as people who earn $100,000 or more per year.
That's not exactly the case, but let it go.
That's exactly what you stated in Middlebury. Therefore, given the fact that people who earn $100,000 a year do not pay their fair share of taxes, do you participate in the tax-sheltered savings plan that the members of the House of Representatives have? And if not, what charities have you donated your income to help champion those causes that you have spoken on behalf of for many years?
As I think you know, we didn't make a big deal about it publicly, but after I was elected, we did put the entire cost of living increase that I received from Congress, I think it's about $5,000, that went into food banks, emergency food banks throughout the state of Vermont, and Jane and I will continue to do that. In terms of the point that you made, what I said in Middlebury was when people said, well, at what point will you begin to raise taxes? What I've said is not that $100,000 is rich. You know, in the great scheme of things, somebody earns $2 million, they're a lot richer. But I think at some point you've got to start raising taxes on people because wealthy people in the last decade, as you know or should know, have seen a decline in their tax rates by incomes of sorts. So what I did say, and what I do believe, is that given the fact that working people and middle-income people have seen a decline in their standard of living, but the cumulative tax effect from the federal, state, and local level has gone up. Middle-income people are being taxed to the teeth. I do think it's appropriate, starting at $100,000 in a progressive way, going after the multimillionaires at a far higher tax rate to ask them to pay more in taxes.
Does that mean you do not participate in the tax-sheltered plan that is available to members of
I'm
Congress?
not 100% sure, but I think my wife and I do, as a matter of fact.
So you're sheltering some of your income from taxes, is that correct?
We are participating in a program that millions of people participate in and that in fact is open, and I believe, to every federal employee.
So you're hiding some of your income from taxes?
I'm not hiding. We pay a significant amount of taxes, and in addition to that, we have 4 kids who are going to college. The fact of the matter is that
Don't you think that's kind of hypocritical
No,
to say that the rich should pay taxes and you hide some of it from taxes?
Mr. Philbin, don't talk about hiding. What we are taking advantage, if we are, is what every federal employee is taking advantage of. No, I don't think there's anything hypocritical. I have fought my entire life. Not so funny, Mr. Philbin. I have fought my entire life for the rights of working people, and I do think that the wealthy should be asked to pay their fair share of taxes. You apparently do not, and that is one of the fundamental differences between us.
Mr. Diamondstone, do you have a question?
Yep. On September 27th,
To whom do you address the question?
on September 27th, the Associated Press reported about a forum in Bennington and did not report Congressperson Sanders' view on the naval war against Iraq. He was asked by Ali Cohen whether there is such a war and whether he supports it. And I think that the folks out there should hear his answer. He said that there's a blockade and that it continues and that he supports it. And I would like him to explain to the folks here, as he did in Bennington, why he supports the ongoing naval war against the civilian population of Iraq.
Well, just to review what I said in Bennington, Mr. Diamondstone, number one, you're looking at one of 6 members of the entire United States Congress, that's 535 people, who consistently voted against that war for a number of reasons. Number two, the difficulty you have right now is that we are dealing with a very vicious and dangerous dictator named Mr. Saddam Hussein, who has consistently gone to war against his own people. He has tortured his own people, he has gassed his own people, and in fact, my hope is that this very bloody dictator will be destroyed and will be defeated and will be overthrown. I do not support efforts to deny the children and the innocent people of Iraq, who in fact are suffering, food, medicine, and the benefits that they need to stay alive. That is not my position, and you're misstating my position if you think it is. On the other hand, would I support Saddam Hussein receiving military aid or other types of aid which can increase the power of his military situation? The answer is categorically no. I want this guy out. But on the other hand, we do want to protect the children and the very innocent people who have been destroyed and are suffering terribly under Saddam Hussein.
We don't have enough time, I think, but let's start through again. Mr. Sanders, do you have a question?
Okay. Mr. Philbin, our family farmers in the state of Vermont, as you may know, are under tremendous pressure. Many of our farmers are being driven off of the land. The State Department of Agriculture a while back did a survey, and the survey indicated that approximately 70% of the farmers in our state believe in a two-tier supply management system, which, in my view and in their view, would guarantee them a reasonable income and at the same time control the overproduction of milk. Do you support, very specifically, do you support a two-tier supply management system, which many people, including Vermont farmers, believe could in fact save the family farm?
I don't have a problem with that, but there's a bigger issue here as well. No, Pat Leahy has been chairman of the Agricultural Committee. He has seniority, and we as Vermonters can't seem to get anywhere. I think what would be probably more important, if that be what farmers want, then I think it would behoove us, and one of the things I want to do when I replace you, is to go down there and form a New England caucus or a Northeastern agricultural caucus so that we have some muscle when we are able to sit down and negotiate how Minnesota and Wisconsin, which basically set dairy policy and a lot of agricultural policy in this country, we need that kind of muscle.
Just to wrap it up, do you support a two-tier supply management system?
I said I didn't have a problem with it.
You believe the federal government should play an active role in this area?
I said I didn't have a problem with it.
Very good.
But we have to get some muscle for Vermont farmers. That's the more important issue.
We have less than 2 minutes left. Mr. Young, ask a brief question.
Brief question. Okay, 43 governors have it, 5 presidents have requested it, Mr. Clinton supports it. The line item veto in an effort to eliminate a lot of pork barreling. Mr. Sanders, would you support that?
No, I wouldn't, because like many other things, the line item veto is not the significant approach that we need to deal with the deficit. Now, we've heard a lot of discussions about the deficit tonight. I think I've been the only one who has been very clear in talking about how, in fact, you can move toward balancing a budget which today is $350 billion in the red. The truth of the matter is that the line item veto would not do that. You must cut military spending. You must ask the wealthy to start paying their fair share of taxes. You cannot continue to dump the S&L bailout into the deficit. That's an outrage. Both parties are unwilling to deal with that issue. You must move toward a national health care system in order to control the incredible increase in health care costs, both in Medicaid and Medicare. You cannot support pork barrel projects like the Super Collider or the space station and a variety of other programs. What you need, Lou, in Congress is the courage finally to say, this is what I believe in, this is how we can do it. I believe, as I said earlier, you can in fact move over a period of 5 years to a balanced budget without coming down on the elderly, on working people and the poor, and I'm leading that effort in the United States Congress.
Thank you, candidates. Thank you, panelists, for joining us. Our thanks to our technical staff for tonight's program. We'd like to thank our viewers around the state that are tuning in through 13 cable systems and those that are joining us on WSYB. And be sure to catch our next forum when we'll be talking with the candidates for governor. Thank you and good night.